In the ancient manuscripts preserved within the great libraries of Alexandria, and later transcribed by the trembling hands of medieval monks who understood only partially what they copied, there exists an image so primordially disturbing that it has haunted the esoteric imagination for over 2,000 years. A serpent, neither benevolent nor malevolent in any conventional sense, coiled in upon itself, devouring its own tail, not dying, not suffering, but consuming itself with what can only be described as purposeful hunger, as though this act of self-cannibalism were not a tragedy, but a sacrament. The image is the Ouroboros, and the question it poses to every soul courageous enough to sit with its implications is not merely philosophical, but existential. What must you be willing to destroy in yourself before you can become what you are meant to be? This is the core mystery of the great work. If you are ready to stop the cycle of superficial addition and begin the genuine work of self-consumption, I've mapped the entire process in the description below. Check the link for the full Magnum Opus System. Now, let's go back to the libraries of Alexandria to understand the origins of this serpent. The Greek word combines aura, meaning tail, and boros, meaning eating. But this linguistic simplicity conceals a philosophical architecture of staggering complexity. The earliest known depiction appears in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, encircling the body of a solar deity, suggesting that even in the most ancient strata of recorded spiritual thought, humanity intuited something profound about the relationship between endings and beginnings, between destruction and renewal, between the self that must be surrendered and the self that waits on the other side of that surrender. When the Hellenistic alchemists of Alexandria encountered this symbol, they did not merely adopt it as decorative imagery. They recognized in it the central mystery of their entire enterprise, the philosophical key that unlocked the meaning of all their cryptic operations and seemingly impossible transformations. The alchemical tradition, stretching from its Alexandrian origins through the Arab philosophers who preserved and elaborated it during Europe's dark centuries, and finally flowering in the laboratories of Paracelsus, Michael Meyer, and the anonymous authors of the Rosarium Philosophorum, was never primarily concerned with the transmutation of base metals into gold. This interpretation, while not entirely false, represents what the alchemists themselves called the lesser understanding, the reading available to those whose eyes had not yet been opened to the true nature of the Magnum Opus. The actual work, the work that consumed lifetimes and consumed fortunes and consumed men's entire identities, was the transformation of consciousness itself. The furnace they heated was not made of iron. The metal they sought to purify was not lead. And the gold they hoped to produce was not measured in coins or weight, but in the quality of soul that emerged from a process so demanding that most who attempted it either turned back or were broken by it before reaching completion. The Ouroboros stands at the center of this tradition, not as mere symbol, but as precise technical instruction. It describes the fundamental nature of the process the alchemists called the Magnum Opus, self-consumption as the mechanism of transformation. The serpent does not feed on something external to itself. It does not grow by devouring another creature. It achieves its mysterious renewal, that eternal circulation of being, by turning its appetite entirely inward. And here begins the teaching that separates genuine alchemical philosophy from every form of superficial self-improvement. You cannot become more than you are by simply adding to what you already are. The accumulation of knowledge, of techniques, of spiritual practices, of psychological frameworks, of identities and roles and achievements does not constitute transformation. It constitutes elaboration. And elaboration, however impressive it may appear from the outside, is not the magnum opus. The magnum opus requires something far more frightening. It requires the willingness to consume. The philosophical architecture underlying the Ouroboros process draws from the most ancient stratum of Hermetic teaching. That axiom inscribed on the emerald tablet attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, as above, so below. But the serpent eating itself reveals a deeper corollary that is rarely discussed even within serious esoteric circles, as within, so consumed. The outer world, the world of accumulated achievements and social identities and carefully constructed personas, is not the primary territory of transformation. It is the inner world, the accumulated structures of personality, the calcified beliefs about who one is and what one deserves and what is possible, that must be subjected to the serpent's teeth. The Ouroboros asks the question that most spiritual seekers spend decades carefully avoiding. Are you willing to eat yourself? To understand what this means in the living texture of actual experience requires entering into the specific language that the alchemists developed to describe the stages of this process. The great work was never conceived as a single dramatic event, but as a series of operations, each building upon the previous, each requiring the successful completion of what came before. The Ouroboros encompasses all of these operations within its circular form, but within that circle, there are distinct phases, distinct tastes and textures of psychological experience that mark progress through the work. The first and most fundamental of these is what the alchemists named the Nigredo, the blackening, and it is here that the serpent first opens its mouth and turns its head toward its own tail. The Nigredo is the beginning of authentic transformation, and it is characterized by something that most contemporary spiritual discourse treats as a problem to be solved rather than a necessary phase to be endured: depression, disorientation. The collapse of the structures of meaning that previously organized one's experience of selfhood. The alchemists described this phase through the imagery of putrefaction, of decay, of matter subjected to extreme heat, until it blackens and breaks down into its most elemental components. The medieval image is visceral and intentional. Before anything can be refined, it must first be reduced to what the alchemists called the prima materia, the prime matter, the undifferentiated substance from which all specific forms can ultimately be shaped. And this reduction is not a gentle process. It is not comfortable. It does not feel like growth. It feels from the inside very much like destruction. What the alchemists understood, and what contemporary psychology has slowly and imperfectly rediscovered, is that the structures of personality that constitute our ordinary sense of self are not who we are. They are what we have built in order to navigate the world as we found it, usually very early in our lives, under conditions of limited understanding and considerable vulnerability. The child who learned that love was conditional developed strategies for securing approval. The adolescent who encountered betrayal constructed defenses against vulnerability. The adult who accumulated wounds that were never properly witnessed or metabolized built elaborate structures around those wounds to keep them contained and to keep the world from touching them again. These structures are not malevolent. They were, at the time of their creation, necessary, but they are not who one is. And the tragedy that the Ouroboros addresses with its terrible compassion, is that these structures eventually become the prison of the very soul they were built to protect. The first self-consumption required by the Ouroboros process is the consumption of these structures. This is what the Nigredo demands. Not the abandonment of the self, but the willingness to examine with unflinching honesty which aspects of the constructed self have ceased to serve life and begun instead to contain it. And this examination is not an intellectual exercise. It is an encounter. It is the serpent turning and recognizing, perhaps for the first time, with genuine clarity, that the tail it has been pursuing is its own, and that it must decide whether it has the courage to bite down. The experience of genuine Nigredo is difficult to distinguish from the inside from pathology, Structures that provided certainty dissolve. Relationships that depended on the false self for their coherent strain or fracture. Purposes that seemed meaningful reveal themselves as defenses against deeper purposes. The individual undergoing Nigredo often loses access to the narrative of their own life, that story they have told themselves and others about who they are and why, and finds themselves in a condition of what can only be called ontological uncertainty. They do not know in any settled way who they are. They do not know what they want. They do not know what to believe. And in this unknowing, which the mystical traditions have sometimes called the cloud of unknowing, and which contemporary psychology might describe as a crisis of identity, the work of transformation actually begins. The prima materia has been reached. The blackening is complete. Something has been released from its fixed form and now waits, amorphous and potential, for what comes next. What the Nigredo consumes is the false self, but the Ouroboros image contains a crucial teaching that is often overlooked in discussions of alchemical transformation. The serpent is not destroyed by its own consumption. It continues. The act of devouring its tail is not suicidal, but generative. Something circulates within the closed form of that circular body. Energy that was locked in the tail, in the most distant and apparently unreachable extremity, is liberated by the mouth's work and returned to the whole. And here the alchemical teaching reveals its deepest insight. The material that appears most remote from the center of the self, the material that has been repressed, denied, projected outward, locked away in the shadow, is precisely the material that contains the highest concentration of transformative energy. The tail is where the gold is hidden. This principle, which Carl Jung spent decades elaborating through the lens of depth psychology, under concepts like shadow integration and the transcendent function, explains one of the most counterintuitive aspects of genuine transformation. The qualities we most disown in ourselves tend to be the very qualities that, if properly integrated, would represent our most significant contribution to our own development and to the world. The person who has buried their anger because anger was dangerous in their childhood carries within that buried anger a vitality and a capacity for boundary setting that, properly developed, represents a kind of strength they cannot currently access. The person who has suppressed their grief because grief was not permitted carries within that suppressed grief a depth of feeling and a capacity for genuine connection that would transform their relationships if it were allowed to surface and complete itself. These qualities, these banished parts of the self, constitute the tail of the Ouroboros. The self-consumption required is not the destruction of these qualities, but the willingness to turn toward them, to encounter them, to allow them back into the circle of conscious life. The second stage of the Ouroboros process, the albedo or whitening, represents what emerges from the successful navigation of the Nigredo. If the Nigredo is characterized by the collapse of old structures, the albedo is characterized by a peculiar kind of clarity, not the clarity of certainty, but the clarity that comes from having shed the layers of accumulated falseness. The alchemists described this stage through the imagery of washing and purification, of the blackened matter being subjected to repeated washing until its essential nature began to appear. The psychological experience of genuine albedo is one of increased transparency, both to oneself and to the world. One begins to see, with a disconcerting precision, the mechanisms of one's own functioning, not merely in the abstract, but in the immediate moment of their operation. The old automatic responses, the defensive maneuvers, the unconscious strategies for securing safety, are no longer invisible. They appear against the washed background of consciousness with an almost uncomfortable clarity. This is not yet transformation in the fullest sense. Seeing one's patterns clearly is not the same as having transcended them. But it represents something crucial, the possibility of choice where previously there was only compulsion. The person who has passed through Nigredo and entered Albedo has not become perfect. They have become, for perhaps the first time, genuinely free. Not free from the tendencies of their own nature, but free to observe those tendencies, to work consciously with them rather than being unconsciously driven by them. The serpent, having completed one cycle of self-consumption, is lighter. What circulates within its body now is more refined than what was there before. The prima materia has been subjected to the first great operation, and though the gold has not yet appeared, something essential has been clarified. The Ouroboros process reaches its most demanding phase in what the alchemists called the Conjunctio, the conjunction of opposites. And it is here that the true nature of the work becomes fully revealed in its difficulty. The human psyche, in its ordinary condition, maintains itself through a system of distinctions that provide psychological stability at the cost of wholeness. Good and bad, light and shadow, acceptable and unacceptable, the self one presents to the world and the self one conceals even from oneself. These divisions are not arbitrary. They serve real functions, but they also fragment consciousness in ways that prevent the kind of wholeness the alchemical tradition describes as the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, that final product of the magnum opus that transforms everything it touches. The Conjunctio asks the practitioner to hold, within a single field of awareness, qualities that seem irreconcilable, the capacity for both profound kindness and fierce anger, the experience of both certainty and radical uncertainty, the awareness of one's own dignity and the simultaneous awareness of one's own smallness. These are not theoretical contradictions to be resolved through clever philosophical maneuvering. They are living tensions that must be held, sustained, endured over time, until something new emerges from the creative friction between them. The alchemists described this phase through the imagery of the chemical wedding, the union of Sol and Luna, the masculine and feminine principles of the psyche, not the dissolution of their distinction, but the achievement of a relationship between them in which both are fully present without either dominating. This is perhaps the most isolating aspect of the entire Ouroboros process. The world around the individual engaged in genuine conjunctio work tends not to understand or support what is happening. The people in their life have adapted themselves to the person as they were, to the predictable patterns of the false self, to the reliable persona. When that persona begins to dissolve and something more complex and less predictable begins to emerge, it creates disruption. Relationships that depended on a particular version of the person may not survive the person's becoming more fully themselves. Communities that provided a sense of belonging may become uncomfortable with the questions that genuine transformation generates. The very authenticity that the magnum opus demands is, in a social world built largely on performance and persona, a profoundly destabilizing force. What sustains the individual through this isolation, through this period of maximum exposure in which the old self has been consumed and the new self has not yet fully formed, is not confidence and not certainty. The alchemists were remarkably clear on this point. Confidence and certainty belong to the Nigredo stage, to the false self that has not yet undergone dissolution. What sustains the work at its most difficult point is something more fundamental and more difficult to name. Perhaps the closest approximation is the recognition that the process itself is trustworthy, that the darkness through which one moves is not a mistake, but a necessary phase of the very transformation one has been seeking. The serpent, in the depths of its self-consumption, cannot see the renewal that approaches. It only knows the peculiar sensation of consuming what it thought was not itself and discovering that it is. The temptation to retreat during this phase is powerful. It is not merely discomfort that generates the temptation, though discomfort is certainly present. It is the fundamental human fear of dissolution, the terror that if the process continues, there will be nothing left, that the self-consumption will prove to be simply consumption without the regenerative arc. This fear is not irrational. Many individuals who approach the edge of genuine transformation and glimpse what it would require turn back at precisely this moment. They choose, often unconsciously, elaboration over transformation. They find a new framework to inhabit, a new identity to construct, a new set of beliefs that accommodates the insights of partial Nigredo without requiring the full dissolution. And this is not a moral failure. The work is genuinely difficult, and the decision about whether one is capable of sustaining it through its most demanding phase is not one that can be made for another person, but for those who do not turn back, for those who choose, out of some combination of desperation and courage and a kind of faith that is almost impossible to articulate, to continue. Something begins to emerge from the crucible of the Conjunctio. The alchemists named it the Rubedo, the reddening, and their descriptions of this phase carry a quality of wonder that even their most cryptic and symbolic language fails to fully contain. The Rubedo represents the emergence of the integrated self, the self that has passed through blackening and whitening and conjunction and arrived at a new condition of being that the alchemists described variously as the achievement of the philosopher's stone, the completion of the great work, the birth of the eternal within the temporal. The integrated individual who emerges from successful Rubedo is not a saint and not a sage in any romanticized sense. They are not beyond suffering. They do not possess special powers or supernatural insights that set them categorically apart from other human beings. What they possess is something at once more modest and more profound, a quality of wholeness, a capacity to contain within a single field of awareness the full range of human experience, light and shadow, strength and vulnerability, certainty and unknowing, without being destroyed by the tension between them. They have eaten their own tail and discovered that the eating was generative. They are not diminished. They are, in the most precise possible sense, more than they were before, not through addition, through consumption and integration. The manifestations of this integration in the texture of ordinary life are subtle rather than dramatic. The integrated individual does not announce their transformation. They do not require external validation of their having changed, because the change is not a performance, but a structural alteration in the very organization of their being. They suffer, but their relationship to suffering has changed. Suffering is no longer the evidence that something has gone wrong, not the sign that the universe is failing to deliver what was promised, but rather one of the primary instruments through which the deepening of consciousness continues to occur. They make mistakes, but their relationship to their own fallibility has changed. The mistake is no longer an occasion for the kind of self-punishment that actually serves to prevent genuine learning, but for the kind of honest examination that allows the mistake to become, quite literally, material for further transformation. The relationship of the Rubedo individual to other people changes in ways that are both enriching and at times painful. Enriching, because the depth of presence that genuine integration makes possible transforms even ordinary encounters into something more substantial. The capacity to truly receive another person, to let their reality land without immediately translating it through the defensive filters of the unexamined self, creates a quality of connection that most people have experienced only in rare moments and only with certain people, but painful because the same authenticity that makes genuine connection possible also makes the toleration of inauthenticity increasingly difficult. The Rubedo individual finds it harder, not easier, to participate in the ordinary social performances that constitute much of daily life. The price of having become more real is a heightened sensitivity to unreality in all its forms. The Ouroboros never stops moving. This is perhaps the most important teaching contained within the image that is also the most frequently misunderstood. The serpent does not complete its self-consumption and then rest in a fixed and final state. The circulation continues. The tail is always within reach of the mouth. The process of the Magnum Opus is not a single journey with a definitive destination, but a spiral, an ever-deepening engagement with the same fundamental mystery at greater depths, with greater precision, with a quality of willingness that becomes simultaneously more demanding and more natural as the practice matures. The gold that was produced in the first great cycle of the work becomes the prima materia for the next cycle. What appeared as achievement becomes, in time, another fixed structure to be subjected to dissolution. The serpent is hungry again. This understanding dissolves what might be called the spiritual materialism of transformation, the subtle but pervasive tendency to treat psychological or spiritual development as a form of acquisition, as though one could accumulate enough insights or complete enough stages or achieve enough integration to arrive at a condition of permanent security. The Ouroboros knows nothing of permanent security. It knows only the eternal circulation, the continuous movement between dissolution and renewal, the willingness to meet each new form of calcification with the same appetite that consumed the last one. And in this knowing, which is not intellectual but experiential, which is not theoretical but lived, there is a freedom that no fixed achievement can provide, the freedom of the moving form, the freedom of the serpent that has made peace with its own hunger. What compels a human being to undertake this work? The question is not rhetorical. The Ouroboros process is not for everyone, and the esoteric tradition has never claimed otherwise. Most human beings live their entire lives in the elaboration of their initial self-structures, refining and expanding what they already are, and there is nothing contemptible in this. The universe requires diversity of approach, but for certain individuals, and they often recognize themselves not through aspiration, but through suffering, the elaborative path eventually ceases to be available. The suffering becomes too acute, or the inauthenticity becomes too suffocating, or the sense of a self unlived becomes too insistent. For these individuals, the Ouroboros is not an option, but a necessity. The serpent turns toward its own tail not because transformation seems appealing, but because the alternative, the continuation of a life organized around structures that have outlived their capacity to serve, has become intolerable. And there is something in this necessity, something in the recognition that the work is not chosen but required, that actually constitutes the most reliable foundation for sustaining it through its most demanding phases. The individual who undertakes the Ouroboros process as a spiritual project, as one option among several appealing paths toward self-development, is likely to encounter the Nigredo and make a different calculation. But the individual who has been backed against the wall by their own life, who has been stripped of the luxury of choosing comfort, often discovers within themselves a capacity for the work that they did not know they possessed. The pressure of necessity becomes, paradoxically, a form of grace. The darkness they cannot avoid becomes, when engaged with sufficient honesty, the very furnace in which transformation occurs. The medieval alchemists worked in physical laboratories, surrounded by the smell of sulfur and the heat of furnaces, and the peculiar beauty of substances dissolving and reconstituting in vessels of glass and stone. They believed, with the sincerity of men and women who had devoted their lives to this belief, that the processes they observed in their physical materials reflected the processes of the cosmos itself. that the transformation of lead into gold in the laboratory was both caused by and causative of a corresponding transformation in the consciousness of the operator. This is what they meant when they said that the work required the presence of the philosopher, that the magnum opus was not a mechanical process that could be completed by anyone with sufficient technical knowledge, but a living process that required, as its most essential ingredient, the genuine engagement of the practitioner's own soul. They were right, not in the way that literal-minded critics have always claimed they were wrong, not in the naive sense that psychological metaphors are more valuable than physical operations. They were right in a deeper sense that their critics have always missed. The laboratory and the psyche were never separate territories for the authentic alchemists. The work was always simultaneously interior and exterior. And in this simultaneity, in this refusal of the division between inner and outer that has so distorted modern consciousness, they preserved a wisdom that the contemporary world is only beginning, tentatively and imperfectly, to recover. The Sol Niger, the black sun, that most paradoxical of alchemical symbols, appears in the manuscripts at moments of maximum darkness, when the process has reached its crisis point and the practitioner is most tempted to abandon the work. The black sun gives no visible light, it does not comfort, it does not illuminate the path ahead, but it burns with an intensity that ordinary light does not possess, with what the alchemists described as the fire of the interior, the source of transformation that cannot be extinguished because it is not fueled by anything external. It is the heat generated by the work itself, by the sustained engagement of consciousness with its own depths, by the willingness to continue the self-consumption even when the darkness is most absolute. This is the fire that sustains the Ouroboros, not faith in the outcome, not certainty about the destination, not the encouragement of others or the validation of teachers or the confirmation of traditions. The fire that sustains the work is the work itself, the strange, self-generating heat that comes from the sincere engagement of the human soul with the mystery of its own transformation. And this fire, the alchemists tell us, is available to every human being. It does not require special gifts or special circumstances. It requires only the willingness to turn, as the serpent turns, and to open the mouth, and to begin the consumption that is also always a renewal. The serpent consumes itself tonight, as it consumed itself last night, as it will consume itself tomorrow. In the darkness before dawn, in the silence between thoughts, in the space where the old self has not yet fully dissolved and the new self has not yet fully formed, the work continues. It has always been continuing, and the gold that emerges from this eternal consumption is not a product that can be displayed or traded or accumulated. It is a quality of being, a depth of presence, a capacity for genuine life that was always waiting within the tail of the serpent, in the most distant extremity of the self, to be liberated by the courage of the mouth that dares to close around what it thought it could not consume. The eternal return is not a cycle of repetition. It is a spiral of deepening, and the soul that has learned to hunger for its own depths will never be without nourishment, for the tail is always there, and the mouth is always ready, and the fire that burns between them is the fire that has no beginning and will have no end. The eternal return is not a destination, but a spiral of deepening. If you seek the map to navigate your own dissolution and renewal, the Magnum Opus System and its 6 stages of transformation are waiting for you. Click the link in the description to join the Hermetic Laboratory. The laboratory is within, and the work continues.